In the context of white supremacy, people of color already are facing racism and then the additional oppression that people might face as well. So that all makes it more complicated for polyamorous BIPOC to be out because there's more risk for us to be out, not just within job situations or things like that, but also within our own communities because there could be rejection within your own communities. And as BIPOC, we need our communities so deeply. We need them for our survival. Sometimes they've been our source of strength in a white supremacy system. And so the idea of being out, you would lose ties to that community. It can make it very difficult and it's not worth it for some people.
Welcome to the Relationship Diversity Podcast, where we celebrate, question, and explore all aspects of relationship structure diversity, from soloamory to monogamy to polyamory and everything in between, because every relationship is as unique as you are. We'll bust through societal programming to break open and dissect everything we thought we knew about relationships, to ask the challenging but transformational questions: who am I, and what do I really want in my relationships? I'm your guide, Carrie Jaroslaw, best-selling author, speaker, intuitive, and coach. Join me as we reimagine all that our most intimate relationships can become. Today's episode is part of our conversation series. I'm just one voice in this relationship diversity movement, and it's important to bring more unique perspectives into the conversation. Today, I'm excited to be talking with Dr. Badiee PolyTherapist about the impact she's making in the polyamorous and non-monogamous narrative. After seeing how much the experiences and perspectives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color were missing in mainstream poly literature and discourse, she became inspired to change that. But first, a little about her. Dr. Badiee is a professor of psychology at California State University, San Bernardino, an educator, scholar, psychologist, and practitioner of polyamory. Dr. Badiee is a licensed clinical counseling psychologist and owner of PolyTherapist Psychology Corporation. Her services include speaking engagements, consulting, and psychotherapy, where she's provided therapy to polyamorous individuals, couples, and polycules for over a decade. In addition to polyamorous people, Dr. Badiee specializes in Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, LGBTQIAP+ folk, and people with ADHD. Her identities as Iranian American, bisexual, queer, polyamorous, and femme shape and inform her work. As an educator, she's conducted speaking engagements to a wide variety of audiences, including therapists, community agencies, and polyamorous groups. Her published scholarly work includes a scientific article co-authored with Avita Sawyers entitled Black, Queer, Femme, and Non-Binary Individuals, Polyamory, an Act of Liberation, in the journal Sexualities, and a chapter on polyamory in the Encyclopedia of Marriage, Family, and Couples Counseling. She aims to change the mainstream discourse on polyamory by centering polyamorous BIPOC in her scholarly and therapeutic work. Dr. Badiee has officially practiced polyamory since 2011, but to some extent identified with it for her entire adult life. She's grateful to have two amazing life partners. Let's get into the conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Relationship Diversity Podcast. I am really excited about my guest today. And I know I say that a lot, but I'm really, really excited because I am wanting to bring more diverse voices in terms of cultures, race, and different identities to this podcast because we need to hear different stories and life experiences. And so with that, welcome, Dr. Badiee, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here.
You have such rich experience. And I would say from your identities alone, so I'm going to read your identities according to you. You identify as an Iranian American, bisexual, queer, polyamorous, femme, and neuro spicy.
Yes.
I love it. I love it because there's so much there that I personally don't have experience with. I haven't talked to people in many of those. And then the intersection of all of them creates an identity all within itself. And you are a therapist, a researcher. You've got a wealth of information that you can share with people. So I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. Before we get into your important work, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and the work you do in the world.
Yes, I would love to do that. Thank you for the warm introduction. You shared some of my identities. Those aren't my only identities, but they do very much inform my work, inform how I see the world on a pretty much daily basis. So those are definitely very important to me. I love my academic work, and that's been really fulfilling, but I'm really excited to now focus more on the polyamorous community in my career. I'm at a point in my career where I really can just focus on the polyamorous community, which I'm so passionate about. And I'm so excited to do that at this stage and really try to help my polyamorous community. So that's where my work is. It's in training therapists to work with polyamorous and non-monogamous clients. It's in doing scholarly work on polyamory, particularly with BIPOC, with people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to bring that more into the scientific literature. So I'm very passionate about that and creating community spaces and providing therapy. So I'm looking forward to being more immersed in the polyamorous community at this point in my career.
That's amazing and much needed because I think there's some articles I've read that polyamorous is a white elitist experience, and it's not true. And it is what is shown for many different reasons. I'd love for you to talk about what you're seeing and the holes that you're seeing in poly literature, specifically with BIPOC and different cultures.
Absolutely. So I'll share a little bit of that as related to how I grew up. So, with all my identities being what they are, I never really found a place I could fit, including in queer communities. And then when I found polyamorous communities, I still never felt like I truly fit until I went into a BIPOC polyamorous space. And I've really been trying to understand for the last few years, what is it about predominantly white spaces that I don't feel as authentic? Not that if there's some white folk there, but if it's a predominantly white space. And so I've been really trying to unpack that within my work, but also really center voices that, because whiteness is so dominant, the way that whiteness has been constructed too, Black and Indigenous people have been genocided and erased and enslaved, and that's how whiteness was constructed. And so those voices in particular are really missing from the polyamorous discourse, even though in pre-colonization, some Indigenous cultures did practice non-monogamy, some African cultures did practice non-monogamy. So that was very much imposed. And so the idea that it's a white thing now is so bothersome because y'all didn't invent this. Actually, this was going on before you got here.
Right. Right.
So, yeah.
I've heard it talked about from Black polyamorous people as a return to our roots, even if it's not the relationship aspect, it's the community aspect. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think that absolutely it's a return. It can be for a lot of us, it's not something new. It's a return. It's part of our decolonizing process where we are really going back to our roots prior to colonization. So for me personally, it's been going into the works of Persian poetry. Like I've really gone into Rumi's odes that he wrote to his spiritual guide. And there is such beauty there and how Rumi defined love and how just it was love was just so much more profound than I think we generally think of love in US culture and US language. So the expansion of love has been such a fulfilling part of my spiritual journey and also part of my decolonizing and unlearning some of these oppressive structures. So going to Rumi's poetry is part of my polyamory process of understanding love on a more profound, on a more complete level. So that's an example of it going back to my roots. Polyamory is returning to my roots of this more expansive form of love.
Yeah, that's powerful because I think jointly, all of us are trying to destigmatize alternative. I don't even like the word alternative, but other ways to love, other ways to be in relationship because of this programming of monogamy and relationships being one man, one woman. And it goes even deeper than that, which is the research I think you're bringing into this world and into this field. I would like to go back a little bit and learn a little bit more about your personal experience with polyamory, what that discovery was like.
Yeah. So I don't think I ever was truly monogamous, but I didn't have the words for it. But once I got into relationships, I had really struggled with fitting into the norms of monogamy, but I would always be very honest. I would always immediately talk to the person, but it was like their whole view of me shifted all of a sudden. So I had a lot of shame and I didn't have the words. So I didn't even know there was such thing. I just thought I was being a bad partner, basically,
Hmm.
and a bad person. I had internalized a lot of shame about that. And then in 2009, Salon published a series of articles on non-monogamy. And I read one and it just clicked for me. Because at that point, I was thinking, well, I'm just not going to get into a relationship. Obviously, I'm not capable of it. So I'm not going to do it. So I'm just going to be alone. That's okay. I like my own company. I'll just be alone. That's fine. But then I found the non-monogamy and I was like, oh, everything clicked. And I realized this is me. And then it took me a little bit longer to find polyamory as a term, but within a couple years, I would say I was officially polyamorous. So I say like 2011 is when I came out to myself. And people that were very close to me, I started coming out and then been more coming out since then.
And where does your education and then your work as a therapist, where did that come in to your lifeline?
That's a great question. It was somewhere in my PhD, I think, that I found the language for polyamory. People knew that I was non monogamous before that, but I think by the time I was getting ready to finish, so when you get your PhD, you have to do an internship for a year where you go and do full time therapy for a year. And the place that I was at, I loved it, but I remember comments about non monogamy from therapists, from training directors saying things like, oh, I've never seen a healthy polyamorous relationship, even though I was right there. But at that point, I was in a healthy polyamorous relationship. And I'm like literally right there. And you're saying this. And I realized, wow, even therapists who are so multiculturally competent in all these other ways, they still have such a bias when it comes to non monogamy. And I really saw this need from then on. So that was in my internship here after I graduated with my PhD and I started working with more non monogamous clients. And then ended up getting into the education aspect. So I've done a lot of different trainings, anywhere from an hour to 3 hour trainings for therapists to be able to work with non-monogamy and specifically with polyamory. So yeah, that's how I got into it. I just saw that there was this big need and the research supports that as well. There's research on how therapists even have these biases. So the same biases that exist in the popular culture, like being immoral, being unethical, being pathologized, something's wrong with you,
Wow.
something's wrong with your relationship. All of those biases, therapists have those also. And they've also done a study where clients talk about the biases that their therapist and how it harmed them. So we have lots of different evidence that therapists, unfortunately, are not equipped or have biases when it comes to non monogamous folk. So that's a big need that I really want to work on addressing.
Definitely, because it's very easy to blame. This is what I've heard from other therapists is the problem is non-monogamy. That's what's causing it. And that is rarely the truth. There's usually problems before that, right?
You're so right, because let's say infidelity is, I think, the first or second reason people break up, right? Unethical non monogamy. And nobody ever questions that monogamy as a structure, though. Nobody ever says, could it be the monogamy that's the issue? But when you're non monogamous, everybody thinks that's the issue. And it's like, no, it's just like any other relationship. So yeah, that's just not true. It's just not true. And actually the research shows the opposite, that either polyamorous people are equal to their monogamous peers in trust, companionate love, and all these other ways, but sometimes even more so.
Mm.
Sometimes there's more polyamorous people are reporting higher trust, higher love, higher passion with polyamorous partners than monogamous folk do with their partners. So the research actually either shows that it's not founded, it's equal, or it's actually the opposite.
That makes a lot of sense because there's a lot more communication, need for communication, clear communication, and openness for it to work. So that then creates more trust. I'd love to hear more about the demographics that you work with in terms of diverse relationships, BIPOC. I don't want to generalize, but what are the experiences that you're finding throughout the BIPOC community in terms of them being able to be themselves in that intersection between race, culture, and relationship diversity, polyamory, non-monogamy, swinging, open relationship?
So, in the context of white supremacy, people of color already are facing racism. So, there's that, and then the additional oppression that people might face as well. So, that all makes it more complicated for polyamorous BIPOC to be out because there's more risk for us to be out, not just within job situations or things like that, but also within our own communities, because there could be rejection within your own communities. And as BIPOC, we need our communities so deeply. We need them for our survival. Sometimes they've been our source of strength in a white supremacy system. And so the idea of being out, you would lose ties to that community. It can make it very difficult. And it's not worth it for some people to be out to their families. And I think the concept of outness also is very white, because just being very flamboyant about it. I like pride. Like, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's a very white culture thing. Whereas I think in other cultures, there's just not that same way of outness. That concept is a little bit, just different. For example, there's a study where they did queer men of color versus white men coming out, and there wasn't benefit for the men of color to necessarily be out. And just like the idea that everybody has to be out in every way is, again, very rigid. And that's also another aspect of white supremacy, this one right way sort of thing. So it makes it more difficult to be out, to be visible. Doesn't mean that people aren't. Obviously, people are, but it is harder. And you have to have some level of privilege. I think that you aren't not going to lose your job, that you're not going to lose your community, your livelihood. But then on the flip side, being a person of color, because you have lived in oppression on a daily basis, I think that polyamory can be one aspect of this larger journey of decolonizing yourself, of unpacking the white supremacy culture, unpacking racialized capitalism, all of those pieces. So it's also a very beautiful experience to be polyamorous as a person of color. And then also finding that community, finding polyamorous BIPOC. It's like the community that you really want. That's the community I felt at home in for the first time ever, really, because I feel like all my identities are not necessarily honored in every space. So I think the community aspect is really, and I think just in general, BIPOC have more of a collectivist way of thinking. So I feel like the way that we practice polyamory, like I'm analyzing a study right now on values, and I haven't seen this perspective in the literature so far that I've seen, where there's a lot of emphasis on everybody in the polycule being happy and everybody supporting each other and creating a community and talking about it in this very much like it's not just about me, but it's about our community and our polycule. And that touches every aspect of people's values. It's been very beautiful. That data, I'm so excited about it. It's not published yet. I'm still analyzing it, but just knowing what values are for BIPOC has been really a delight.
I think that's what I was saying about community, and specifically BIPOC is that community. It is a way of coming together, yes, in the identity of BIPOC and polyamory, but it goes so much deeper than that. I wanted to go into this new paper that you've just published. We're recording in August, and you have today just published A very important paper. I would love to hear more about this paper and your inspiration for it and more of your findings.
I am so excited about this paper. It was such a labor of love. In my hardest days of polyamory during the pandemic, I was so blessed to find the work of Vita Sawyers, and she had these daily polyamory reminders, and it got me through a really tough time. And through her, I found other Black queer content creators as well. And again, having this journey where I didn't feel like I ever fit into the polyamorous communities or polyamorous literature, to see the work of Evita especially was so powerful, and so much like taking into context our humanity as a person and going really in depth into things. And I was so inspired by her work, and it had such an impact on my personal polyamory journey. And so excited that you're going to interview her as well. She really inspired me. And then when I got to a place where I felt like, okay, now I'm in a place where I've processed those difficult things that happened to me, and I really want to give back to these individuals who have not just made a difference in my life, but also made a difference in so many others' lives. And I really want to bring their voices to the academic literature, which within the academic literature, there's actually more than people would think on polyamory. There's probably like 70 to 100 papers or so, at least last time I checked. There's quite a large amount, but there are no studies on polyamorous BIPOC. There's only two papers that talk about Black polyamory specifically, and that's it. Everything else
Wow.
is very white. Everything, like the studies, sometimes they don't even mention the racial and ethnic demographics. So you know that they're probably white, mostly white. But if they do, it's usually majority white, usually at least 90%. So much of what we know in the scientific literature is based on white polyamory. And unfortunately, I wish this wasn't the case, but sometimes documenting something academically does preserve it to some extent. And I don't think that should be the case, but it is the case. It's true. And I wanted to make sure that these voices were preserved and that they would shape the discourse, because I honestly was like, what they're saying in their content is a million times better than what I'm seeing in these papers. So there was a lot of papers about liberation and polyamory being liberatory. You can't be liberatory without acknowledging race, without unpacking race. There's just no way, especially in a US
Yeah.
context. And yeah, there's a lot of unpacking of queerness, of gender, but that's it. And it was done among white people. And so finding these Black queer creators and knowing how much of a difference they made in my life, and being like, I really want to uplift these voices because they deserve to be in the academic literature. And probably the only reason they're not is because they didn't have the opportunity and the oppression that they faced. If they wanted to be, they could have been. And so I wanted these brilliant minds to be in the academic literature. So it was such a wonderful journey for me, going deep into their content, analyzing it on a deep level, diving deep into Black queer studies literature as well. It was such a labor of love, and I'm so happy about it. I'm so excited to share it with the world.
That is incredible because these are voices we need to hear. For someone who maybe has trouble reading academic papers, but really wants to get the information, understand it, and broaden their awareness, what are things that you could share with us that you learned?
I think one of the things that I did that was really fascinating was documenting a history of the word queer. And so that was really fascinating to trace back how queer was used in the US, and then later how queer theory was adopted into academia. But originally, the original queers in the US were actually Black folk. In the 1890s, the term queer came into political discourse and as a tool to criminalize Black folk. And actually, it was defined as, and this is a direct quote, uncontrollable Black bodies that could only be interpreted and governed through policing and incarceration. And then obviously, if there's any visible queerness, there's additional scrutiny and everything. So that was a really fascinating thing to know that Black people are the original queers, which was why I also think Black people should be centered in discussions of queerness and expanding the concept of queerness, because their voices are now left out. Like, the queer theory really emerged in the 80s, the 90s, and queer activism. And that was very white and not really including as much Black queer voices. And so I highly recommend learning from Black queer folk, because I feel like they've been left out and there's so much that they have to teach us because of their intersecting identities. So that was one thing that was really interesting that I learned. I learned about the context of slavery in the US, captivity, that context of captivity that Black Americans were forced into. There's metaphorical ways that it continues, and that shows up in all of our relationships. This idea of Black people keeping them in captivity, that gets internalized. That anti-Blackness gets internalized by all of us and affects everyone. And that also relates to the hierarchies we have in capitalism, because I don't want to be captive, so I have to be better than this next person. So that was a big takeaway, learning how much slavery has impacted, and continuation of it has impacted everyone's relationships. And everyone needs to unpack that. I think I had a sense of that, but it really hit it home that that was the case. One thing I learned is that improving safety in polyamorous communities is not just about inviting people of color to your events. It's also about this critical self-reflection of really trying to unpack, how have you been affected by white supremacy? How have you been benefited from it? How have you been harmed by it? So, like, for me, I am a person of color, but I am light skinned. And so I have benefited from white supremacy in that my light skin gives me a proximity to whiteness that someone who is darker skinned wouldn't benefit from. So that's how I benefit from white. That's a very superficial way, but that's one way that I benefit from white supremacy. So what does that mean? How does that look like? What are some ways that I can notice that having that proximity to whiteness maybe showed up in my behavior? So it's really unpacking those things within yourself. That's such an important thing to do to make BIPOC feel safer, is really just doing that critical examination within yourself. So that was a big takeaway.
Yeah, that I love that. I want to hear more takeaways, and we'll talk more about what I can do to help. And one of the things that you just said is critical self-reflection. And that's a very important aspect that we can all do. And so let's continue with some more takeaways. How many pages is this?
It's 20 pages. It's fairly long.
Yeah.
I think one thing that was so beautiful that I just didn't think about it this way was, sometimes I don't know if you've ever, maybe on your podcast, asked people about their polyamory. Well, you did. Yeah. You asked me about my polyamory origin story. Yeah. You've heard a lot of polyamory origin stories. But I think one of the most beautiful ones that I heard came from this paper, where it was from Cherie Calico Roman, was the person that said it. But basically, she grew up in these Muslim communities. And she said that in that time, people did have multiple partners. And she was talking with her cousin about it. And there's an expression also in her culture that you want for your sister what you want for yourself. You want this best that you want. You also want that for your loved ones, for people. And so she was talking with, I think, a cousin or something, and the person told her, if you had a great partner, wouldn't you want the world to experience them? And I thought, wow, what a beautiful, selfless way. Similarly, Shanae Jackson Kendall had a similar experience, who I also cite in the article, where she talks about that experience of learning the generosity that she learned in her culture extended to her polyamory. And so I think that's really beautiful and prompted a lot of self-reflection for me of, like, how did the things I love about Iranian culture, like generosity, how do they relate to my polyamory? So I think it was a beautiful thing to learn that people's polyamory origin stories can be rooted in care for others.
Yeah. Wow. I think we can learn so much from these voices. And so, with you bringing more light to these voices, bringing it in poly literature and getting the research, and it is part of us learning from other races and cultures. and learning more about their lives. And education and awareness is so important for someone like me who just doesn't have that experience. Where do you see this work going? What are your visions?
I envision doing multiple ways of this one topic, which is polyamorous BIPOC. So, for example, I just did a study that I collected data on over 400 polyamorous BIPOC about different aspects of their experiences. And the one that I'm analyzing right now is about their values related to polyamory. But I'm also going to look at BIPOC's experiences of how they think their experiences is different from white folk, because the vast majority of them said yes, that it is very different. And so I'm going to be looking at that as well. I'm going to want to publish something on specifically what is unique about the polyamorous BIPOC experience. I also asked them about their therapy needs. So I also want to publish something on therapy as well. So this is all in a process of a year or two. It's not going to be something that's done overnight, but those are some of the areas that I see my research growing in.
Well, we'll just have to have you on in a year again so we can learn more about this. What would be your most ideal, beautiful vision of the evolution of diverse relationships from your perspective? What does that look like 10, 15 years from now?
I hope that we can have a more complete, including all voices, including voices that have been silenced. I just hope we can have a more informed from all these different groups that are polyamorous, but don't show up in the literature. Again, partly because of it's just harder to be out. So then people are like, well, polyamory is all white. So I think just being able to unpack aspects of white supremacy culture on a deeper level, on racialized capitalism. I hope that people do that deeper exploration of really trying to unpack that within themselves. So that's something that I really try to talk about ways to do that. I think the people that you're going to have on also give great ways to unpack those things. I think the more you can do that, the safer you're going to make things for other people. And then just taking accountability too, and realizing intent is not impact. I think as a polyamorous culture, I want us to have that as a value, because I think as polyamorous people, there's so much that you have to do because you're having these different emotional relationships. So I feel like there's more work and talking through things because the connections are just numerically more and qualitatively more. So there's just more things. So I think we really have the opportunity to lead the way in terms of creating values and unpacking those things if we just allow ourselves. And I think we have to allow ourselves and really look at ourselves critically as a community and really bring in those voices and elevate those voices, and also within ourselves as well. And take accountability when we have hurt someone, because that's just what you're going to do in connection sometimes. And it's okay. And you can take accountability without centering yourself and move forward.
And grow and evolve within yourself.
Yes.
So I love all of those. That gives me really tangible ways that I can support and continue to educate myself, do self-reflection, and take accountability for my words, for my actions, for my thoughts, for my feelings, and continually ask questions and get more information. I really appreciate your work because it is really important for not only the polyamorous community, but for the world and for this country. Definitely. We need more education, and the idea of this decolonizing relationships and just life is really important if we are to evolve as a country and as a world. Dr. Badiee PolyTherapist, how can people find you if they want to learn more about your work, if they want to work with you? What's the best way for them to connect with you?
So I am committed to posting daily content about polyamory, decolonizing relationships, and mental health through my social media platforms, which is on Instagram and Threads, Dr. Badiee PolyTherapist, and on TikTok, it's PolyTherapist. And my website's polytherapist.com.
Polytherapist.com. We're going to have all of those links in the show notes. And you really inspire me by the work that you're doing on Instagram. Every day she posts, every day. And it's really thoughtful content. So if you are wanting to educate yourself more, which is one of the pieces we talked about, Please go follow her on Instagram and TikTok and Threads, and go check out her website because she's doing some really important work and helping us all to make this world a better place. So thank you, Dr. Badiee, so much for being here. And I look forward to connecting in a year from now to hear all about what you've done since this interview. Thanks so much for listening to the Relationship Diversity Podcast. Want to learn more about relationship diversity? I've got a free guide I'd love to send you. Go to www.relationshipdiversitypodcast.com to get yours sent right to you. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. You being here and participating in the conversation about relationship diversity is what helps us create a space of inclusivity and acceptance together. The more comfortable and normal it is to acknowledge the vast and varied relating we all do, the faster we'll shift to a paradigm of conscious, intentional, and diverse relationships. New episodes are released every Thursday. Stay connected with me through my website, carriejaroslow.com, Instagram, or TikTok. Stay curious. Every relationship is as unique as you are. Are you wondering why you never seem to find lasting fulfillment in your relationships? Or do you create the same kinds of relationship experiences over and over again? Can you never seem to find even one person who you want to explore a relationship with? Have you just given up hope altogether? If this sounds like you, my recent book, Why Do They Always Break Up With Me, is the perfect place to start. The foundation of any relationship, whether intimate or not, is the relationship we have with ourselves. In the book, I lead you through 8 clear steps to start or continue your self-exploration journey. You'll learn about the importance of self-acceptance, gratitude, belief shifting, and forgiveness, and given exercises to experience these life-changing concepts. This is the process I use to shift my relationships from continual heartbreak to what they are now, fulfilling, soul-nourishing, compassionate, and loving. It is possible for you. This book can set you on a path to get there. Currently available through Amazon or through the link in the show notes.